You know what nobody tells you about failure? It's not the opposite of success. It's actually the thing that comes right before it. And there's one guy who proved this better than anyone else in history. But here's the crazy part. When he was at his lowest point, broke, humiliated, and completely destroyed, he made one decision that changed everything. And that decision? It goes against everything we're taught about bouncing back from failure. Stick around because what he did next is going to mess with your head. So let me tell you about this guy. His name was Henry Ford. Yeah, that Ford, the car guy. But before he became the car guy, he was just some failed entrepreneur who everybody laughed at. And I mean everybody. His own father thought he was wasting his time. His investors called him crazy. His first company went bankrupt. His second company failed even harder. And by the time he hit his third attempt, people weren't just doubting him anymore. They were actively betting against him. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Let me take you back to where this whole thing started. Detroit, Michigan. Late 1800s. Henry Ford was working as an engineer for the Edison Illuminating Company. Pretty decent job, right? Stable income, respect from his peers, a future that looked secure. But Henry had this obsession. He couldn't stop thinking about cars. Or what they called horseless carriages back then. Every spare moment he had, he was in his shed, tinkering, building, trying to create something that would change transportation forever. Now, his wife Clara supported him. She believed in him when literally nobody else did. And in 1896, after years of work, he finally did it. He built his first car, the quadricycle. It was basically a frame on 4 bicycle wheels with an engine. Nothing fancy. But it worked. It actually worked. Henry was so excited, so sure this was going to be his big break. He showed it off to everyone. He drove it around Detroit. People stared. Some were amazed. Most thought it was a silly toy. But Henry didn't care what they thought. He knew he was onto something, so he did what any ambitious person would do. He started looking for investors. He needed money to actually produce these cars, to turn his dream into a real business. And after months of pitching, of convincing, of selling his vision, he finally got some people to believe in him. In 1899, he left his job at Edison and founded the Detroit Automobile Company. This was it. This was his moment. Everything he'd worked for was finally coming together. He had investors, he had a team, he had the skills and the knowledge. What could go wrong? Well, everything. Everything went wrong. The cars he produced were low quality. They broke down constantly. They were expensive. And worst of all, Henry was such a perfectionist that he kept stopping production to make improvements. He couldn't just put out a product and move forward. He had to make it perfect. And his investors? They were losing patience. Fast. Within a year, the company was struggling. Within 2 years, it was dead. The Detroit Automobile Company shut down in 1901. Henry Ford's first major business venture was a complete failure. All that money, all that trust, all those dreams gone, and the people who had invested in him, they weren't happy. They felt cheated. They spread the word that Henry Ford was a dreamer, not a businessman, that he couldn't deliver, that he was too obsessed with perfection to actually succeed. Now, most people would have given up at this point. A shame alone would be enough to make someone walk away. But not Henry. He convinced himself that he'd learned from his mistakes, that this time would be different. So in 1901, just months after his first company failed, he started over. He found new investors, started the Henry Ford Company. And you know what? It failed even faster than the first one. This time it wasn't even about the quality of the cars. It was about control. Henry wanted to run things his way. His investors wanted returns. They clashed constantly. Henry was so difficult to work with, so stubborn, so unwilling to compromise, that his own investors kicked him out. Out of his own company. The company that had his name on it. They brought in someone else to run it and basically told Henry to get lost. Can you imagine that? Being removed from a company with your own name? So now Henry Ford was 0 for 2. 2 failed companies. A reputation in ruins. No money. No investors who would touch him. And a family to support. His wife Clara was still by his side, but even she must have wondered if maybe, just maybe, everyone else was right. Maybe Henry was chasing an impossible dream. Maybe he should just go back to being an engineer, take a regular job, and forget about this whole car business. But here's where things get interesting. Because this is the moment where most people would make the obvious choice. They'd either give up completely or they'd try to fix their reputation, prove the doubters wrong. Do whatever it takes to show everyone they're not a failure. And that's exactly what Henry Ford didn't do. Instead, he made a choice that seemed completely insane to everyone around him. A choice that went against every bit of conventional wisdom about bouncing back from failure. Henry decided to build a race car, not a practical car, not a car for everyday people. Not a car that would make money. A race car. Just one car. Built purely for speed. And he was going to race it himself against the best racers in the country. His friends thought he'd lost his mind. What was the point? How would this help his business career? How would this win back investors? It wouldn't, at least not in any obvious way. But Henry understood something that most people don't. He understood that sometimes you have to change the game entirely. See, Henry's problem wasn't that he couldn't build cars. His problem was that nobody trusted him anymore. Nobody believed in his vision. And you can't convince people with words when they've already made up their minds about you. You have to show them something so undeniable, so impressive, that they have no choice but to pay attention. So in 1901, while everyone expected him to be licking his wounds and begging for another chance, Henry Ford was in his workshop building a monster of a car. He called it the Sweepstakes. It had a massive 2-cylinder engine. It was loud, it was dangerous, and it was fast. Really fast. Faster than anything else on the road. And in October 1901, Henry entered it in a race at a track in Grosse Pointe. His opponent was Alexander Winton, the most famous race car driver in America at the time. Winton was a champion. A legend. Everyone assumed he would destroy this failed businessman who was playing at being a racer. The race started. Winton took an early lead. Henry was behind struggling, his inexperience showing. The crowd probably thought this was going to be a blowout. But then something shifted. Henry started gaining ground. Lap by lap, he closed the gap. Winton's car started having problems. Smoke was coming from the engine. And Henry, this guy who everyone had written off, this 2-time failure, crossed the finish line first. He beat the best racer in America. And suddenly, everyone was talking about Henry Ford again. But here's the thing. Winning that race didn't directly solve any of his problems. He still didn't have a company. He still didn't have investors. He still had a reputation as someone who couldn't run a business. But what he did have now was attention. And more importantly, he had proof. Proof that he could build something exceptional. Proof that when he set his mind to something, he could beat the best in the world. And that changed everything. People started reaching out to him. New investors, ones who hadn't been burned before, wanted to talk. And among them was a guy named Alexander Malcolmson. Malcolmson was a coal dealer, a businessman who understood risk and reward. He saw something in Henry that others had missed. Not just the talent, but the determination. The refusal to quit. So in 1903, they formed a partnership. Malcolmson put up the money. Henry would build the cars. And this third time, they called it the Ford Motor Company. Now you'd think Henry would have learned his lesson about being a perfectionist, about trying to control everything, about clashing with investors. But he hadn't. Not really. He still wanted to do things his way. He still had this vision of a car for the masses, something affordable and reliable that ordinary people could own. And his investors? They wanted luxury cars for rich people. That's where the profit margins were. That's what made sense from a business perspective. But Henry fought them on it. And this time, somehow, he won the argument. In 1908, the Ford Motor Company released the Model T, and this is where everything Henry had been working toward finally came together. The Model T wasn't fancy. It wasn't luxurious. It wasn't even particularly comfortable. But it was reliable, it was simple to repair, and most importantly, it was affordable. At least it started that way. Henry's goal was to make it even cheaper over time. To bring the price down so low that practically anyone could afford one. And that's exactly what he did. He invented the assembly line production method. Well, he didn't invent it exactly, but he perfected it for automobile manufacturing. Instead of having workers build an entire car from start to finish, each worker would do one specific task as the car moved down the line. It was repetitive, it was boring, but it was incredibly efficient. Production time for a single car dropped from over 12 hours to about 90 minutes. And as production time dropped, so did the cost. The price of a Model T kept falling year after year. From $850 in 1908 to less than $300 by the 1920s. People couldn't believe it. A car that ordinary families could actually afford. It changed everything. American life transformed almost overnight. People who had never traveled more than a few miles from their homes could suddenly go anywhere. Farmers could get their products to market faster. Families could live in the suburbs and commute to work in the city. The entire landscape of America shifted because of this one product. And Henry Ford, the guy who had failed twice, who had been laughed at and kicked out of his own company, became one of the richest and most powerful men in the world. But here's what's really interesting about this story. It's not just about persistence. Everyone knows you're supposed to keep trying after you fail. That's not revolutionary advice. What makes Henry Ford's story different is the choice he made in the middle. That decision to build a race car instead of immediately trying to start another company, because that wasn't persistence. That was strategy. That was understanding that sometimes the direct path doesn't work. Sometimes you have to take a detour that doesn't make sense to anyone else. Think about it. If Henry had done what everyone expected, if he'd immediately tried to start a third company, found new investors, promised to do better this time, he would have failed again. Nobody would have taken him seriously. He would have been begging people to give him another chance, and people don't respect that. They don't invest in that. But by doing something completely unexpected, by proving himself in a totally different arena, he changed the narrative. He went from being a failed businessman to being the guy who beat Alexander Winton, and that gave him credibility. That made people curious about what he could do next. And this is a pattern you see over and over again in history. People who bounce back from massive failures don't usually do it by trying the exact same thing again. They do it by finding a new angle, a new approach, a way to reframe their story. Steve Jobs got kicked out of Apple, the company he founded. But instead of trying to fight his way back in immediately, he started next in Pixar. He proved he could succeed without Apple, and then Apple came begging for him to come back. Walt Disney's first animation studio went bankrupt. So he moved to Hollywood and started over with a new approach. Colonel Sanders got rejected over 1,000 times trying to sell his chicken recipe. But he kept refining his pitch, changing his strategy, until finally someone said yes. The point is, failure isn't a roadblock. It's information. It tells you what doesn't work. And if you're smart, you use that information to find a different path. Henry Ford learned from his first 2 failures that just being good at building cars wasn't enough. He needed leverage. He needed a way to make people pay attention, and that race gave it to him. It was the spark that lit everything else on fire. But let's talk about what happened after the Model T became successful. Because this is where Henry's story gets complicated. See, success changed him. Or maybe it revealed parts of him that were always there. He became controlling, stubborn, unwilling to adapt. The same perfectionism that had caused his first companies to fail started showing up again. As the automobile industry evolved and competitors started offering new features, different colors, more comfort, Henry refused to change the Model T. He had this famous quote where he said customers could have the car in any color they wanted, as long as it was black. He meant it as a joke, sort of, but it also revealed his mindset. He thought he knew better than everyone else. He thought his way was the right way, the only way. And for a while he was right. The Model T dominated the market for years. But by the 1920s, General Motors and other competitors were catching up. They were offering cars with more features, more style, more options. And customers were starting to choose those cars over the Model T. Henry's market share began to shrink. His own son, Edsel, who worked at the company, kept begging him to update the design to give people what they wanted. But Henry wouldn't listen. It took until 1927 for Henry to finally admit that the Model T had run its course. He shut down production, closed all the factories, and spent months developing a new model. The Model A, and it was successful, sure, but those months of shutdown cost the company millions. And they lost momentum they never fully regained. General Motors took over as the top car manufacturer in America. Ford was still huge, still profitable, but they were no longer the undisputed leader. All because Henry couldn't adapt. Because the same stubborn determination that had made him successful in the first place eventually became his weakness. And that's something worth paying attention to. The traits that help you succeed can also destroy you if you're not careful. Henry's refusal to quit, his insistence on doing things his way, his perfectionism, these things saved him when he was starting out. They gave him the strength to push through 2 catastrophic failures and try again. But later, those exact same traits made him rigid and out of touch. He couldn't see that the world had changed. He couldn't accept that maybe, just maybe, other people had good ideas too. There's also this darker side to Henry Ford that we need to talk about. Because he wasn't just some quirky, stubborn inventor. He had some really awful beliefs. He was anti-Semitic. He published a newspaper called the Dearborn Independent, that spread conspiracy theories and hate about Jewish people. He even received a medal from Nazi Germany in 1938, and while some people try to excuse this by saying it was a product of the times, that's not good enough. Plenty of people in that era didn't believe those things. Plenty of people spoke out against that kind of hatred. Henry Ford chose to promote it, and that's part of his legacy too. So when we talk about his success, when we celebrate his innovations and his determination, we also have to acknowledge the harm he caused. The people he hurt with his words and his influence. Because success doesn't erase that. Money and fame don't make someone a good person. And the lesson here isn't just about bouncing back from failure. It's also about understanding that how you succeed matters. What you do with your success matters. The impact you have on the world matters. But let's get back to the main story. The thing about failure that most people don't understand is that it's less not actually about the failure itself. It's about what the failure reveals. When Henry Ford's first company went under, it revealed that he was too much of a perfectionist. When his second company kicked him out, it revealed that he couldn't work with others. And those revelations could have destroyed him. They could have been the end of the story, but instead he used them. He learned to pick his battles. He learned when to fight for his vision and when to compromise. And most importantly, he learned how to create leverage. That race car wasn't just about winning. It was about creating a moment that would change how people saw him. It was about forcing a reset on his reputation. And that's the real lesson here. When you fail, especially when you fail publicly, everyone forms an opinion about you. They decide who you are and what you're capable of. And you can spend years trying to change their minds with words, with explanations, with promises. Or you can do something so impressive, so undeniable, that they have to reconsider everything they thought they knew about you. Henry chose the second option, and it worked. Now, I'm not saying you should go build a race car. That's probably not relevant to whatever failure you're dealing with. But the principle applies to everything. If you failed at something and people have written you off, the worst thing you can do is immediately try the exact same thing again while begging for another chance. What you need is a win, any win. Something that proves you're capable of more than people think. It doesn't have to be in the same field. It doesn't have to be directly related to your goal. It just has to be impressive enough to make people look at you differently. And here's the thing about that strategy. It requires confidence. Not fake confidence, not bravado, but real confidence in your abilities. Because you're essentially saying, I know everyone thinks I'm done, but watch this. And then you have to deliver. You have to actually pull it off. If Henry had lost that race to Alexander Winton, if he'd made a fool of himself in front of everyone, that would have been it. Game over. No one would have given him another chance after that, but he believed in himself enough to take that risk. And that's what separated him from all the other people who had failed and given up. There's this quote that gets attributed to Henry Ford, and I don't know if he actually said it or not, but it's relevant here. The quote is, whether you think you can or you think you can't, you're right. Everyone else thought he couldn't, and he was right. They were wrong. But it's not just about positive thinking or manifesting success or any of that stuff. It's about putting in the work to back up what you believe. Henry spent countless hours in his workshop. He learned from every mistake. He studied what worked and what didn't. He didn't just believe he could succeed. He made himself capable of succeeding. And that's the part people always skip. They hear these stories about persistence and determination, and they think it means just keep doing the same thing over and over until it works. But that's not what Henry did. After his first failure, he analyzed what went wrong. After his second failure, he realized he needed more than just investors. He needed the right partners who would give him the freedom to execute his vision. Each failure taught him something, and he applied those lessons to his next attempt. That's not just persistence. That's learning. That's growth. And you know what else? He got lucky. Let's be honest about that. He got lucky that Alexander Winton's car had problems during that race. He got lucky that Alexander Malcolmson was willing to invest in him. He got lucky that the Model T came out at exactly the right moment when America was ready for affordable automobiles. Luck plays a huge role in every success story. But here's the thing about luck. It only matters if you're in a position to take advantage of it. If Henry had given up after his second failure, if he'd gone back to being an engineer and abandoned his dreams, none of that luck would have mattered. He wouldn't have been in the race. He wouldn't have met Malcolmson. He wouldn't have created the Model T. You put yourself in situations where good things can happen. You keep trying different approaches until something works. You stay in the game long enough for the odds to eventually fall in your favor. And yeah, some people get luckier than others. Some people are born into wealth or connections or opportunities that most of us will never have. That's real, that's unfair. But it doesn't change the fundamental truth that giving up guarantees failure, while persisting at least gives you a chance. Let's talk about timing for a second. Because Henry Ford's success wasn't just about his skills or his determination. It was also about being in the right place at the right time. In the early 1900s, America was changing rapidly. Cities were growing, infrastructure was being built. People were moving away from farms and into urban areas. The economy was booming. And there was this growing sense that technology was going to transform everyday life. If Henry had tried to do the exact same thing 50 years earlier, it wouldn't have worked. The market wasn't ready. The infrastructure wasn't there. If he'd tried 50 years later, he would have been competing with established car companies that already dominated the market. But in 1903, the timing was perfect. The automobile industry was in its infancy. Nobody had figured it out yet. There was space for someone with a new approach to completely change the game. And that's another lesson about failure and success. Sometimes it's not about you at all. Sometimes the market isn't ready. Sometimes the technology doesn't exist yet. Sometimes the world needs to change before your idea can work. And if you're too early, if you're ahead of your time, it can feel like failure even though you're actually onto something. The key is recognizing whether you're failing because your idea is bad or because the timing is wrong. Because if it's the timing, maybe you need to wait. Maybe you need to work on something else for a while and come back to your big idea later. Or maybe you need to find a way to change the timing to create the conditions that will make your idea viable. Henry didn't just wait for the market to be ready. He helped create the market. By making cars affordable, by proving that ordinary people would buy them, he created demand that didn't exist before. That's another level of entrepreneurship. Not just meeting existing demand, but creating new demand. Showing people something they didn't know they needed, and that's risky. Because you're betting that you understand what people want better than they understand it themselves. But when it works, when you're right about that, you don't just succeed. You change the world. Now let's think about what Henry's life was actually like during those years of failure. Because it's easy to tell this story like it's just a series of events. First company fails, second company fails, builds race car, wins race, starts third company, becomes successful. But the reality was so much messier than that. Imagine being in his shoes. You're in your late 30s, early 40s. You've spent years working on this dream. You've convinced people to invest their money in you and then you fail. And all those people lose their money because of you. Your reputation is ruined. Everyone you meet has already heard about your failures. They've already decided you're not worth their time. And it's not just about business, it's personal. Your father doesn't believe in you. Your neighbors think you're crazy. Your wife is supportive, but you can see the worry in her eyes. Because you have a family to feed, bills to pay, and you're gambling everything on this obsession that nobody else understands. How do you get up every morning? How do you keep working when everyone thinks you're wasting your time? How do you silence that voice in your head that says maybe they're right, maybe you should just give up and get a normal job? That's the real test, not the skills or the knowledge or even the strategy. It's the psychological battle. The fight against self-doubt and fear and embarrassment. And Henry won that battle. Somehow, despite everything, he kept believing in himself. He kept getting up every morning and going to his workshop and trying to solve the problems that everyone else said were unsolvable. And that's heroic in a way. Even with all his flaws, even with the terrible beliefs he held later in life, there's something admirable about that refusal to quit. That determination to prove everyone wrong. But let's be real, that level of determination can also be destructive. Because sometimes you should quit. Sometimes an idea really is bad. Sometimes the people who are telling you to stop are actually trying to help you. And figuring out the difference between a good idea that needs more work and a bad idea that should be abandoned is one of the hardest things in the world. Henry got lucky that his idea was actually good. That cars really were going to change the world. That his vision was right and everyone else was wrong. But for every Henry Ford, there are probably 100 people who destroyed their lives chasing ideas that were never going to work, who refused to quit when they should have, who ended up broken because they couldn't let go. So how do you know? How do you know when to keep pushing and when to walk away? I don't think there's a perfect answer to that. But I think you can look at the evidence. Are you learning from your failures? Are you getting better? Are you making progress, even if it's slow? Or are you just doing the same thing over and over and hoping for different results? Are people rejecting your idea because it's ahead of its time, or because it's actually flawed? Are you getting any validation at all, even small wins that suggest you're on the right track? Or is it just failure after failure with no signs of improvement? Henry had evidence that his core idea was sound. He could build cars. The quadricycle worked. The race car worked. His problem wasn't the product, it was the business side. And that's something you can learn and improve. But if he had been trying to build cars that didn't work, if the technology had been fundamentally flawed, no amount of determination would have saved him. So pay attention to what your failures are telling you. Are they pointing to a fixable problem or a fundamental flaw? That's how you know whether to keep going or move on. Here's something else that's interesting about Henry's story. He had help, a lot of it. Clara, his wife, supported him emotionally and financially. She believed in him when he had no reason to believe in himself. Alexander Malcolmson provided the capital and the business expertise that Henry lacked. The workers at Ford Motor Company, the engineers and designers and assembly line workers, they were the ones actually building the cars. Henry gets all the credit because he was the founder, the visionary, the name on the building. But he didn't do it alone. Nobody does. And I think that's an important thing to remember when we talk about failure and success. When you fail, it's easy to feel isolated. Like you're the only one who's ever screwed up this badly. Like everyone else has their life figured out, and you're the only one struggling. But that's not true. Everyone fails. Everyone struggles. And everyone who eventually succeeds does it with help from other people. So if you're going through failure right now, if you're at that low point where everything seems hopeless, reach out. Talk to people. Find mentors, friends, family members, anyone who believes in you or can offer guidance. Because trying to do it all alone is a recipe for burnout and despair. You need support. You need perspective from people who can see things you can't see when you're too close to the problem. And if you're on the other side of that, if you're someone who's doing okay right now, and you know someone who's struggling, help them. Be their Clara. Be their Alexander Malcolmson. Believe in them when they can't believe in themselves. Because sometimes all it takes is one person saying, I think you can do this, to give someone the strength to keep going. And maybe they'll fail anyway. Maybe their idea really isn't going to work out. But at least they'll know they had someone in their corner. At least they'll know they weren't alone. And that matters more than you might think. Let's talk about what happened to the Ford Motor Company after Henry died, because this is also part of the story. Henry passed away in 1947. By that point, he'd been in declining health for years and had mostly stepped back from running the company. His son Edsel had died a few years earlier, which devastated Henry. So when Henry died, his grandson, Henry Ford II, took over. And Henry II had a huge mess to deal with. The company was losing money. Management was chaotic. Competitors were way ahead in terms of design and innovation. Ford Motor Company, which had once been the most dominant force in the automobile industry, was on the verge of becoming irrelevant. Henry II spent years fixing the problems his grandfather had created. He brought in new leadership, updated the car designs, modernized the factories, improved labor relations. And slowly, he turned the company around. Ford became competitive again. They created iconic cars like the Mustang. They innovated and adapted in ways the original Henry never would have. And the company survived. It's still around today, still one of the major players in the automotive industry. But it's not the dominant force it once was. And that's partly because of Henry's inability to change, his refusal to let go of control, his conviction that he was always right even when he was clearly wrong. So what's the lesson there? Maybe it's that the skills that help you build something aren't always the same skills you need to maintain it. Maybe it's that ego and stubbornness can destroy what determination and creativity built. Or maybe it's just that nothing lasts forever. That every empire eventually falls, every success eventually fades. And the best you can hope for is to make an impact while you can, and then get out of the way so the next generation can take over. I don't know, but it's something to think about. There's this tendency when we tell these stories about successful people to make them sound like heroes. Like they were special, chosen, destined for greatness. And I think that does a disservice to everyone. Because it makes success seem like something that only happens to certain people. People with unique talents or gifts or qualities that the rest of us don't have. But that's not true. Henry Ford was just a guy. A stubborn, flawed, complicated guy who had an idea and refused to let it go. He wasn't smarter than everyone else. He wasn't more talented. He just kept trying when other people gave up. And yeah, he had skills. He understood mechanics and engineering. But lots of people understand mechanics and engineering. What made him different was the determination and the willingness to bet everything on his vision. And you have that capacity too. Whatever you're struggling with right now, whatever failure you're dealing with, you have the same capacity for determination that Henry had. You can make that same choice to keep going, to find a new angle, to prove everyone wrong. It won't be easy. It probably won't happen as fast as you want. You'll face setbacks and disappointments and moments where you want to quit. But you can do it. The question is whether you will. Whether you'll find that thing inside yourself that says, I don't care what anyone else thinks. I know this is possible. And I'm going to make it happen no matter what it takes. Because that's what it really comes down to. Not talent, not luck, not timing, although all those things help. It comes down to the decision you make when everything is falling apart. When you've failed and everyone is watching and you have every reason to walk away. Do you give up? Or do you figure out a new approach and try again? Henry Ford chose to try again. And that choice changed the world. Your choice might not change the world. It might just change your world, but isn't that enough? Isn't your life, your dreams, your potential worth fighting for? Let me tell you something else about failure. It never feels like the stories make it sound. When you're in the middle of it, when you're living it, it doesn't feel like a character-building experience or a stepping stone to success. It just feels like failure. It feels like shame and regret and wondering what's wrong with you that you couldn't make it work. And all the motivational quotes in the world don't make that feeling go away. All the stories about people who failed before they succeeded don't make your specific failure hurt any less. Because your failure is real. It's happening to you right now and it sucks. And I'm not going to pretend otherwise. But here's what I will say. That feeling, as awful as it is, isn't permanent. It feels permanent when you're in it. It feels like you'll never be happy or confident or successful again. But feelings lie. They're not facts. They're just emotions passing through you. And if you can sit with that discomfort, if you can acknowledge the pain without letting it destroy you, you'll eventually find that it fades. Not completely, maybe. You might always have some scar tissue from the experience, but it gets better. It becomes a story you tell instead of a wound that's still bleeding. And that's when you can start moving forward again. Henry Ford probably spent a lot of time feeling like a failure. Lying awake at night wondering what he was doing wrong. Questioning whether he was delusional for thinking he could succeed when everyone said he couldn't. But he didn't let those feelings stop him. He felt them, he acknowledged them, and then he kept working. And I think that's the real secret to bouncing back from failure. Not that you avoid the pain or pretend it doesn't hurt, but that you don't let the pain become your identity. You don't let one failure, or 2 failures, or 10 failures define who you are and what you're capable of. You let it be information, data, evidence of what doesn't work, which helps you figure out what does. Think about all the little decisions that led to Henry's success. The decision to build that first car in his shed. The decision to leave his stable job at Edison. The decision to start a company even though he had no business experience. The decision to try again after the first company failed. The decision to try again after the second company failed. The decision to build a race car when everyone thought it was pointless. Every single one of those decisions was a risk. Every single one could have led to more failure and humiliation. But Henry made them anyway. And each one moved him closer to eventual success. Your life is the same way. It's just a series of decisions. Some big, some small. And every decision is a chance to move toward what you want or away from it. You can decide to try again. You can decide to learn from your mistakes. You can decide that this failure doesn't define you. Or you can decide that it's too hard, that you're not strong enough, that you might as well give up. Both choices are valid. Both are understandable. But only one gives you a chance at the success you're dreaming about. And maybe you don't succeed. Maybe you try and fail again. Maybe you never achieve the big goal you're chasing. That's a real possibility. We have to be honest about that. Not everyone who tries succeeds. Not everyone who deserves success gets it. Life is unfair like that. But even if you don't reach the destination you're aiming for, at least you tried. At least you gave yourself a chance. At least you can look back and say you didn't quit, you didn't let fear or failure stop you. You kept going as long as you could. And there's dignity in that. There's value in that. Even if the world never knows your name, Even if you never become famous or rich or successful by conventional measures, you'll know. You'll know that you were brave enough to try. Henry Ford once said something like, "Failure is simply the opportunity to begin again." This time more intelligently, and I think that sums it up pretty well. Failure isn't the end. It's just the end of one attempt. It's information about what doesn't work, which is incredibly valuable if you're willing to learn from it. And the more intelligently you approach your next attempt, the more you apply the lessons you've learned, the better your chances become. It's not guaranteed, but it's possible. And possible is all you need. So if you're sitting there right now, dealing with some failure that's crushing you, wondering if you should try again or just accept that it's over, I want you to think about Henry Ford. Not as some superhuman success story, but as a regular person who screwed up multiple times and kept going anyway. He wasn't special. He was just stubborn. And maybe that's all you need to be too. Just stubborn enough to try one more time. Just determined enough to believe that maybe, just maybe, this next attempt will be the one that works. Because it might be. You don't know until you try, and not trying is the only guaranteed way to fail. Let me tell you about one more thing. The Model T wasn't perfect. Even at its peak, even when it was dominating the market and changing the world, it had problems. It was uncomfortable. It was hard to start in cold weather. It required constant maintenance. People complained about it all the time. But none of that mattered because it solved a bigger problem. It gave people freedom and mobility they'd never had before. And that was enough. That was everything. So, when you're working on your thing, whatever it is, don't aim for perfection. Aim for good enough to solve the problem. Aim for valuable enough that people will overlook the flaws. Because perfection is impossible and waiting for it is just procrastination in disguise. Henry learned that the hard way. His perfectionism killed his first company. He kept stopping production to make improvements and his investors ran out of patience. But by the time he started Ford Motor Company, he'd learned to ship. To get the product out there and improve it over time. The Model T went through countless small improvements over the years it was in production. But the first version was good enough to launch. Good enough to start changing the world. And that's what you need to focus on. Not making something perfect, but making something that works well enough to put out there and see what happens. There is a saying in the startup world, if you're not embarrassed by the first version of your product, you launch too late. And that's so true. If you wait until everything is perfect, until every detail is exactly right, someone else will beat you to market. Someone else will launch their imperfect version and start getting feedback and making improvements while you still tinkering in your workshop. So launch before you're ready. Put your work out there before it's perfect. Let the market tell you what needs to change instead of trying to guess in advance. That's how you learn. That's how you improve. That's how you succeed. Now, I want to address something that might be on your mind. You might be thinking, okay, but Henry Ford had skills. He knew how to build cars. He was an engineer. What if I don't have any special skills? What if I'm just average at everything? And here's what I'd say to that. Henry Ford wasn't born knowing how to build cars. He learned. He spent years teaching himself, experimenting, failing, trying again. He wasn't gifted. He was obsessed. And obsession, combined with time and effort, can overcome a lack of natural talent almost every time. Think about it. If you spend 10 years working on something every single day, you're going to get good at it. Maybe not the best in the world, but good enough to compete. Good enough to create value. Good enough to succeed. The problem is most people don't have that level of commitment. They dabble. They try something for a few months and then move on to the next thing when it doesn't immediately work out. They spread themselves thin instead of going deep on one thing. And then they wonder why they're not getting anywhere. But if you pick one thing, just one thing that matters to you, and you commit to it fully, you'd be amazed at what you can accomplish over time. Henry Ford picked cars. That was his thing. For decades, that's all he thought about, all he worked on, all he cared about. And eventually, inevitably, he got really good at it. Good enough to change the world. You can do the same thing. Pick your thing. Commit to it. Work on it every day. Learn from your failures. Keep improving. And see what happens. Maybe you'll change the world too. Maybe you'll just build a decent business or career. But either way, you'll have something you can be proud of. Something you built through your own effort and determination. I also want to talk about privilege for a second. Because Henry Ford had some advantages that we should acknowledge. He was a white man in America in the early 1900s. That meant he had access to opportunities that women and people of color didn't have. He could get loans, start businesses, be taken seriously in ways that other people couldn't, and that matters. That's part of why he succeeded. So when we tell his story, we can't pretend it was just about merit or hard work or determination. Those things mattered, but so did his privilege. So did the systemic advantages he had just by being who he was. And if you're reading this and you don't have those advantages, if you're facing barriers that Henry never had to deal with, I see you. I acknowledge that it's harder for you. That you have to work twice as hard for half the recognition. That the odds are stacked against you in ways that are fundamentally unfair. And I can't fix that. This story can't fix that, but what I can say is that it's still possible. It's harder, it's less likely, the system is rigged against you. But it's still possible. People succeed against those odds every single day. And maybe you'll be one of them. Or maybe you'll fight your whole life and never get the recognition you deserve. But at least you'll know you fought. At least you won't spend your life wondering what could have been if you just tried. Let's bring this back to the beginning. The choice that turned failure into success. For Henry Ford, that choice was building a race car instead of immediately trying to start another company. It was taking a detour that nobody understood in order to create leverage and change his narrative. But the deeper choice, the one that really mattered, was the decision to not give up. To believe in himself and his vision, even when literally everyone else had stopped believing. To keep working, keep learning, keep trying, even when it seemed hopeless. That's the choice that changed everything. And you have that same choice in front of you right now. Whatever failure you're dealing with, whatever setback you've experienced, you get to decide what happens next. You can let it be the end of your story. You can accept defeat, walk away, find something easier to do with your life. Nobody would blame you for that. Failure hurts. It's exhausting. And sometimes the smart thing to do is to cut your losses and move on. But if there's still something inside you that believes in the dream, that thinks maybe it could work, that's not ready to let go yet, then don't. Hold on to that, feed it, let it grow, and see where it takes you. Because here's what I've learned from studying stories like Henry Ford's. The people who succeed aren't the most talented. They're not the smartest or the luckiest. They're just the ones who refuse to quit. The ones who keep showing up, keep putting in the work, keep believing when belief is the hardest thing in the world. And most of them fail over and over before they figure it out. But they keep going. They keep trying. And eventually, if they're smart about learning from their mistakes, if they're willing to change their approach, if they get even a little bit lucky, something clicks, something works. And all those years of failure suddenly become the foundation for success. That could be your story too. This failure you going through right now could be the thing you talk about years from now, when you're retelling people how you made it. How you were at your lowest point and you made a choice to try again. How you found a new angle, a different approach, a way forward that nobody saw coming. How you proved all the doubters wrong. Or maybe it won't be. Maybe you'll fail again. Maybe this isn't your time, but you won't know unless you try. And not knowing, living with that regret, wondering what could have been, that's worse than any failure. So here's what I want you to take away from this. Failure is not the opposite of success. It's part of the process. It's information. It's a stepping stone. And the only time failure becomes permanent is when you stop trying. Henry Ford failed twice before he succeeded. And his success changed the world. Your success might not change the world, but it could change your world. And that's worth fighting for. That's worth getting back up one more time. That's worth believing in even when nobody else does. The choice that turned failure into success wasn't about talent or luck or timing, although those things helped. It was about determination. It was about refusing to accept defeat. It was about finding a new angle when the old one didn't work. It was about believing in yourself when everyone else had stopped believing. And it was about putting in the work day after day, year after year, until finally, inevitably, things started to fall into place. You can make that same choice. Right now, today, you can decide that this failure doesn't define you. That you're going to learn from it, grow from it, use it as fuel to come back stronger. You can decide to try again, but smarter this time. More strategically, with a better plan. You can decide to find your leverage, your race car moment, the thing that will make people sit up and pay attention. Or you can just decide to keep going, to keep showing up, to keep putting one foot in front of the other until you get where you're trying to go. It won't be easy. Nothing worth doing ever is. There will be days when you want to quit. Days when you wonder if you're just delusional for thinking you can succeed. Days when the doubt and fear are so overwhelming you can barely get out of bed. But you'll also have days where things click. Where you make progress. Where you see evidence that maybe, just maybe, this could actually work. And those days make all the hard days worth it. Those days remind you why you're doing this. Those days keep you going. And years from now, when you've made it, when you've achieved the thing everyone said was impossible, you'll look back on this moment. This failure, this low point. And you'll realize it wasn't the end at all. It was the beginning. It was the moment that taught you who you really are, how strong you can be, how much you can endure, and you'll be grateful for it. Not because failure is fun or because struggle is noble, but because it made you into the person you needed to be to succeed. Because without it, you wouldn't have learned the lessons you needed. You wouldn't have developed the skills and the resilience and the determination that made success possible. So embrace it. Not in some toxic positivity way where you pretend it doesn't hurt, but in an honest way where you acknowledge the pain and the difficulty and the fear and you keep going anyway. Where you let it shape you without breaking you. Where you use it as fuel instead of letting it be an anchor. That's what Henry Ford did. That's what every successful person who's ever failed has done. And that's what you can do too. The choice is yours. It's always been yours. Nobody else can make you succeed. Nobody else can force you to keep going. But nobody else can stop you either. Not really. They can doubt you. They can laugh at you. They can tell you it's impossible. But they can't actually stop you from trying. Only you can do that. Only you can make the decision to quit. And only you can make the decision to keep fighting. So what's it going to be? Are you going to let this failure be the end of your story? Or are you going to use it as the beginning of your comeback? Are you going to believe what everyone else says about you? Or are you going to prove them wrong? Are you going to play it safe and avoid more failure? Or are you going to take the risk, knowing you might fail again, because the potential reward is worth it? The choice that turns failure into success starts right here, right now, with you deciding what happens next. And whatever you decide, I hope you make it count. Because your life, your dreams, your potential, they're worth fighting for, even when nobody else believes it. Especially when nobody else believes it. Because that's when your belief matters most. Henry Ford changed the world because he refused to let failure define him. He refused to accept that everyone else was right and he was wrong. He refused to quit. And that refusal, that stubborn determination to keep going no matter what, is the only thing that separates people who eventually succeed from people who don't. Everything else is just details. So make the choice. Take the risk. Try again. And see what happens. Because the only way to guarantee failure is to stop trying. And you're not ready to do that yet. I can tell. If you were, you wouldn't have read this far. Something inside you still believes, still hopes, still wants to try. So listen to that voice, trust it, and let it guide you forward into whatever comes next. Hit subscribe for more stories like this.